says, tonight we are going to discuss the concept of moving from phenotypes to EPDs. So, as the billing goes, I am going to attempt to take some of the mystery out of the calculation of EPDs. And I know for some of you, the calculation of EPDs is somewhat of a black box. In order to understand the concept or the calculation of EPDs, we have to have some understanding of the genetic model. And as the billing goes, the genetic model is the holy grail of animal breeding. The genetic model is something we as seed stock breeders should understand. And I know when you hear that word genetic model, that may strike fear in your heart. But it doesn't need to. I can assure you that if you have, and model, first of all, model implies an equation, and that also, I'm sure, may strike some fear in some of you. But I can assure you that if you can add and subtract and you have a little bit of common sense, you won't have any trouble understanding the genetic model. And as I said, it's really at the core of animal breeding, so we as seed stock breeders really should have an understanding, at least a baseline understanding of the genetic model, and once we have that, we can easily see how we move from phenotype to EPD. So I'll start out with a question that I asked the group several months ago. It was actually at the National Red Angus meeting last fall. And I had a set of audience responders, and I put this question up on the screen, and I asked them to tell me which one of these is considered a phenotype. And as you can see, I've got pregnancy status, temperament, appearance, ear length, all of them, and none of them. Okay, you hear? Okay. You hadn't been hearing me? Okay. Okay, so yeah, getting back to on track, I asked this question at the annual Red Angus meeting, had some audience responders so they could actually respond back to me, and I'll show you the response here in a few seconds, but these are the options I gave them as far as what would be considered a phenotype. And as you can see on the screen, we've got several different traits, and then we've got all of the above or none of the above. And I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it, and then I will show you what the response was from the group of Red Angus breeders last fall. Turns out that 50% of the Red Angus breeders selected all of the above. The next response, almost 30%, shows appearance, and then 18%, surprisingly enough, chose ear length. I think they were maybe trying to be a bit humorous. Down to 3% said none of these qualified as phenotypes, and then there weren't any takers for pregnancy status and temperament. So what is a phenotype? What is a phenotype? And in order to understand the genetic model, we need to understand what a phenotype is. We need to know what a phenotype is, and we probably all have somewhat different definitions of a phenotype, but there actually is a universal definition, and I'll get to that here in a minute. But I think for most of us, when we talk about phenotype, what we're generally talking about is the visual appearance of an animal. We might say that that animal has a very impressive phenotype, or that animal is very impressive phenotypically. And generally what we're talking about is this visual impression we have of the animal. It might be its structure, it might be its muscularity, it might be its masculinity, any number of things that we're assessing. Well, it turns out that that is, in fact, a phenotype. That is a valid phenotype. But there are also several other things that we measure that qualify as phenotypes. And as far as a quick and dirty definition of phenotype, simply anything we can measure on an animal. Anything we can measure on an animal qualifies as phenotype. So when we're looking at an animal, we're visually appraising that animal. Our gauge is our eyeballs, right? And we might not write down our assessment of that animal on a piece of paper, but we certainly could. But we also know that a birth weight is a phenotype. Moving over the next picture, we're looking at feed intake gauge, a system that actually measures feed intake, and that is a phenotype. And then an ultrasound machine, certainly a phenotype. And then we're looking at Dr. Dykman in the cooler grading carcasses, and those are certainly phenotypes. Again, a measurement anytime, a weight taken any time in an animal's life is a phenotype, and even whether or not an animal's pregnant or open. And we do that via rectal palpation, so we're doing that with our fingers. Or we can certainly do that with an ultrasound machine. That also constitutes a phenotype. So there are many different ways to gauge and measure phenotype: scales, ultrasound machines, and our fingers and our eyeballs, but they are all phenotypes. Basically, that's anything we can measure. And yes, in fact, if we were so interested, I don't know why we would be, but if we were interested, we could actually measure an animal's ear length, and that would qualify as a phenotype. So that moves us to the genetic model. In order to understand the genetic model, we need to understand what a phenotype is. And as I said, it's anything we can measure on an animal. And what the genetic model does for us is it breaks down the phenotype. It breaks down the phenotype. And as I said, model implies equation. So I'm going to show you an equation, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time. But as I said, you can add and subtract and have a little bit of common sense. You won't have any problem with this. So here is the genetic model. We've got a phenotype, and that phenotype equals an average, a population average, plus a breeding value, and that breeding value is the value of an animal as a parent due to the genes it possesses, and then environmental factors, environmental influences. And the theory holds that you can explain every animal in a population, every phenotype collected on an animal in a population can be broken down in this fashion, and we can explain every phenotype in a population using this equation. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we look in this case, we've got 9 million animals, and I chose 9 million animals because we've got now 9 million animals, or even more than that slightly, in our database. And we have a corresponding set of phenotypes. In this case, we're talking weaning weight, and throughout this presentation, I'll stick with weaning weight. So we've got a set of weaning weights. We've got 9 million of them, in fact. And as you can see, the first animal is 850, and the last animal, number 9 million, weighed 680 pounds. Okay, so those are the phenotypes we have. Now, that's the left-hand side of our genetic model, or our equation. The right-hand side, we break down in this fashion. Remember, we've got an average, a breeding value, and an environmental factor. Okay, for the first animal, we might see something like this. We've got an average of 725 pounds. We've got a breeding value of 10 pounds, and an environmental effect of 115. And when you add those together, you come up with the phenotype. That's 850 pounds. Then we move down to animal 2, 720-pound phenotype. That constitutes an average that comes from an average of 725. And one thing you'll notice is that every animal will have the same average. That's because it's a population parameter. It's a constant. It is the average of all 9 million animals in this case. So the average is going to stay the same for every animal that this equation is applied to in this population. As you can see, this animal has a breeding value of -5, and an environmental effect of 0 in this case, and that sums up to 720. If we move to animal 3, again, as you can see, we've got the same average, right? And we've got a breeding value of 25 and an environmental effect of minus 150. And we could do this 9 million times and come all the way down to animal 9 million. Again, you see the same average. 9 million has a breeding value of 20 and a environmental effect of 65. Now, we as animal breeders are particularly interested or primarily interested in the breeding value component, okay? And when you look at that breeding value, you notice we've got average. An average, that's a big number. We're talking weaning weight, and the average is a big number, 725. But you'll notice the other two components, breeding value and environment, are deviations, right? They're plus and minus 5, 10, 15, 100. So they're deviations. And you should be very familiar with the deviations I just circled. If you are using EPDs, you will be very aware that EPDs are simply deviations. They're simply deviations, plus or minus something. And in fact, what an EPD is simply half of the breeding value. An EPD is half of this breeding value. And the reason is that it is half. When we look at a breeding value, remember I defined breeding value as the value of the animal, or the value due to the genes that an animal carries, and they have a direct impact certainly on the animal's phenotype, on the animal's weaning weight. All of the genes that an animal possess has an impact on that animal's weaning weight. But when that animal becomes a parent, it passes on a sample half of those genes, just a sample half, to its calves, and that's why we need to, if we're assessing the value of an animal as a parent, the EPD of the animal, that's why we cut that breeding value in half, because we're just dealing with a sample half of those genes. So if we know an animal's breeding value, we can get its EPD simply by cutting it in half. Very straightforward. Now, that said, I'm going to tell you that breeding value, the column you see there, is something we do not know with 100% certainty. We do not know breeding value with 100% certainty. It certainly looks good on that screen. We've got all the numbers in place and everything looks hunky-dory, but we never know breeding value with 100% certainty. So what do we know? Well, let's take a look at that equation. We're again back to the genetic model. And if you go back to your math class, and you think, well, if I don't know something in an equation, let's call it x, typically the unknown would be x. And in this case, it's breeding value. Okay? We're interested in breeding value. Like I said, we as animal breeders, we as seed stock producers, we're interested in breeding value. Okay? If you think back to your math class, how can we get at breeding value if we don't know what it is? Well, let's look at the other components. Remember, if we know the other components, we don't have to know x, but we can solve for x, right? So if we know phenotype, we know average, we know environment, we know breeding value without knowing it directly. Okay, so that's our goal. That's our goal, to know the other factors which indirectly give us breeding value. So if we look at that equation, what do we know? Well, we know phenotype, right? We know phenotype. We've measured it. We get thousands and thousands of phenotypes from all of you throughout the year, various traits in many animals. So we have phenotypes. We know the phenotype. We know what it is. It's 700 pounds. It's 650 pounds. It's some value. We certainly know average. We know average. We can take the average of the population. So that's also known. So now all we've got left is the environment, right? If we know environment, piece of cake. We've got breeding value. Well, unfortunately, environment is a bit of a fly in the ointment. There is some uncertainty when it comes to environment. There is some uncertainty when it comes to environment. So what do we do about that? What can we do about that? We know phenotype, we know average, and if we knew environment, it'd be a piece of cake. We'd have breeding value lickety-split. But we don't know environment with absolute certainty. So what do we do? Well, what animal breeders do is they start breaking that component down. So we want to break environment into its component parts. So what constitutes the environmental effects? Well, one obvious thing is age. We know age is a major environmental effect. In fact, we know when we look at a graph, we know that as the age of the calf moves on, if you take the same calf at 100 days versus the same calf at 200 versus the same calf at 250 days, we obviously are going to expect an increase in weaning weight. And by studying populations, we can actually make an adjustment for that effect. In fact, we've decided, and this is somewhat arbitrary, but we've decided 205 days is the average age to adjust to. And so if animals are below that or above that, we adjust them to 205 days. And that graph doesn't depict things exactly, but we do know that early in a calf's life, we tend to see, or earlier in the weaning phase, we tend to see a little more rapid growth and tends to taper off as animals approach the latter end of weaning. So we can make pretty good adjustments for that. Okay? And we also know age of dam. Age of dam is a big environmental effect. And we know young dams don't milk as much. Maybe they're not quite as good of mothers. And they don't wean as heavy a calf. And as they move on towards maturity, if they hit 5 years old, somewhere in there, between there and about 10, they pretty much plateau. And as they get on into their elderly stage, we tend to see a tapering off in weaning weight of their calf. So we can deal with that. We can make adjustments for that. So we can handle age. We can handle age pretty well. We can make adjustments for the age of the calf and the dam. Do pretty well there. So we're chipping away at this environmental effect. So what else affects the? What else is a component of environment? Well, heterosis. Heterosis is actually an environmental effect, and I'll explain to you why. So if we look at heterosis, we have this percent of maximum heterosis is the ultimate level or the ultimate achievement or the ultimate gain from crossbreeding that we can achieve through heterosis. And if you look at the two animals in the middle, if we cross two unrelated breeds, in this case we've got a Red Angus and a Simmental, we get 100% of that maximum heterosis. We get that when we're crossing two breeds. If we look down below that, that Red Angus and Simmental, we see a half Simmental, half Angus sire, half Simmental, half Angus dam, and that combination will give us 50% of maximum heterosis. Then up at the top we see two Simmentals. Two Simmentals, we get 0% of maximum heterosis. When you cross, when you mate two purebred animals of the same breed, we make the assumption that we are achieving no heterosis. Okay, and of course we're going to have everything in between. These are just some examples. We're going to have heterosis that runs all the way from 1% to 100 of maximum. And we also have direct heterosis, which is the heterosis that a calf possesses primarily for growth and individual traits. And then we have maternal heterosis, which is heterosis due to crossbreeding of the dam, which generally adds growth to the calf when it comes to weaning weight anyway, adds growth to the calf due to extra milk production. So we can do a pretty good job, and those of you that have been raising hybrid cattle, those of you that have been sending in your data, your birth weights, weaning weights, and yearling weights on hybrid cattle, you will notice that we actually subtract birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight from the adjusted weight when we make the adjustment due to heterosis. The more crossbred the animal is, the more we will subtract. And some of you might contend, well, that doesn't seem fair. I'm actually having my adjusted weights reduced because of heterosis. Well, the reason we do that is because heterosis is not passed on. It's not part of the breeding value component I was talking about, the value of an animal as a parent. Heterosis is simply due to crossbreeding, and heterosis is all dependent on what you mate an animal to. You get no heterosis if you mate an animal to something that it's related to, the same breed, and again, you get 100% maximum heterosis if you mate it to something it's totally unrelated to. So that is independent rather, of breeding value, and that is why we make adjustments for heterosis level, both the heterosis of the calf and the heterosis of the dam. So we can, through equations and knowledge of the impact of heterosis on various traits, on birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, carcass traits, so forth, we can make adjustments. So again, we've whittled away a little more at that environmental effect. So what else impacts environment? What other components are in that environmental effect? Well, another component is contemporary group, and this is a big one. This is a big one. So here's an example of two sire groups. We've got sire A on the left-hand side, sire C on the right-hand side. Sire A's calves average 792 pounds at weaning, and those are adjusted weights. We've adjusted all these weights already for age of dam, age of calf, and heterosis. So they're all fully adjusted. We've made those adjustments. So we look at sire A at 792, sire C at 550. Without any other context, we would certainly assume that sire A is superior to sire C for weaning weight. And if we were interested in going out and buying some calves to increase the growth in our herd, we would certainly gravitate towards the calves out of sire A. Now, let me throw you a little bit of a curveball. These two sire groups were raised in different contemporaries. They were raised as different contemporary groups. The left-hand side, sire A was raised, his calves were raised in a very lush pasture with creep feed and just kind of like heaven on earth for cattle. Over on the right side, you see sire C's calves were raised in a parking lot, basically. Pretty rough conditions. So that has to give one pause when we know that. That has to make one think, well, how superior is sire A to C? He certainly seems superior by all measures, but you know, we've got to take some consideration as to the environment that these calves were raised in. So how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, in the past what we did was we ratioed these groups. The thinking was, well, we'll ratio these groups and then we can compare them, because sire A's calves will average 100, and the heavier calves will be above 100, the lighter calves will be below 100, and the same with sire C, and then we can compare them. Well, there's a big problem with that. There's a monumental problem with that. In order to do that, in order to accept comparison in ratios, we have to assume that the genetic level of those contemporary groups is equal. Now, is there any reason to think that? No. There's no logical reason to think that contemporary groups across the country are equal for genetic level. In fact, we know they're not. They can be dramatically different for genetic level. So that's not a very effective means of comparing animals. Ratios are not an effective means of comparing animals. What else can we do? Well, some people thought, well, you know, we can adjust for the fact that they're creep fed. If a producer tells us his calves are creep fed, we can make an appropriate adjustment. Well, sure, we can look at the data and we can figure out that, well, on the average, creep feeding gains 50%, adds 50% to weaning weight. Okay? The problem with that approach is kind of depends on how good the quality of the feed is. If it's high energy or just oats, there's certainly going to be a difference in growth. If the producer keeps the creep feeder full versus filling it up every other July, certainly going to make a major difference in the impact of creep feeding. So that isn't very effective, and some of you may be aware of the fact that we have an option when you send in your data. We have an option of designating whether or not a contemporary group was creep fed. We do not use that option. That option is immaterial. Whether or not an animal's creep fed has nothing to do with its EPDs. Another thought might be, well, you know, we can compare, we can have producers send us the assessment, their own assessment of the value of their pasture. You know, how valuable or how potent is their pasture? Well, that's pretty difficult to do. That's most people would probably tend to assume that their cattle were raised in the most difficult environment possible, and everybody else's was raised in a lush environment, but that's of course not the case. So that really doesn't work very well either. Well, fortunately for us, back in the late 60s and 70s, there's a fellow named Charles Henderson who was developing the methodology that would actually break through and allow us to compare cattle across the country. What we're talking about now is methodology that allows us to compare cattle all over the country, which is what makes EPD so powerful. Okay, and he was working on this back in the late 60s and 70s, and he had the methodology, but the computing power did not come down the pike. There was not enough computing power to actually put this into practice until the mid-80s, at least to put it in practice on a large data set the size of the Simmental Association. It was actually the mid-80s. What did Dr. Henderson do? Well, he noticed that even though A and C, sire A and C, may never have competed directly, they generally, contemporary groups, had animals that tied them together. In this case, we've got sire B. Sire B sired 4 calves in each one of these contemporary groups. Okay? A and C didn't compete directly, but there was bull B that competed in both of those contemporary groups. And when we put a pencil to it, we see over in the lush pasture, sire B's calves weighed 815 pounds. Their adjusted weight was 815 pounds. On the other side of the fence, in the parking lot, sire, which, by the way, 815 pounds outdid sire A. So he was superior to sire A. On the other side of the fence, the 512 pounds is actually inferior to sire C. So from this, we can deduce that, or at least infer that it turns out that sire C is actually superior to sire A when it comes to growth. And this is just a small scale example. In our database, we have 9 million animals. And every one of those 9 million animals, their relationship between every other animal in that database is calculated. So we have, if we were to draw these lines between all the animals in our database, we'd have lines going every which direction till the cows come home. So Dr. Henderson's methodology was really a breakthrough, and you could call it it was a seminal event, so seminal that it was really the backbone of modern genetic evaluation. It allowed us finally to compare cattle across the country, and this is how it's done. Now, it's very obvious when you look at these two very stark differences in contemporary group, it's very obvious that we would expect to see more growth in the left-hand side than the right-hand side. But we can actually see pretty stark differences in weaning weight in cattle that are raised on the other side of the fence. Okay? We can have the same cattle on both sides of the fence and see fairly sizable differences in weaning weight due to non-genetic reasons, due simply to contemporary group. And the reason I bring that up is we often see breeders submit data where there's 200, 300, 400 calves in a contemporary group. That's fine as long as they're in the same pasture. As long as they're truly raised in the same pasture, there's nothing wrong with that. But if they were in fact in different pastures, it doesn't matter if they were on the other side of the fence or they were in your operation, in your herd, they should be in different contemporary groups, because the way the system works is when the system is analyzing a contemporary group, the assumption that is made is those cattle were raised in the same environment, in the same pasture. And oftentimes we can look at the two pastures, and for all intents and purposes, as far as we can see, they're identical. There's no difference between them. But studies have found that we still will have differences in pastures even though they're side by side. So this is just a rule of thumb or a suggestion to any of you. If you want the most accurate EPDs possible, make sure you group your cattle in the way they were raised, including the pasture they were raised in. So now we've covered three components of environment: age, heterosis, and contemporary group, and we can do a very good job of assessing them. We can essentially adjust for all of those environmental factors. Is there anything left? Is there anything left? Well, in fact, there is. And this is a real fly in the ointment. Unknown environmental effects, and it's the thing that gives animal breeders nightmares. It is the thing that gives animal breeders nightmares. We can deal with phenotypes and averages and age and heterosis and contemporary group. We can adjust for them. But when it comes to unknown environmental effects, we cannot adjust for them. We don't know what they are. By definition, they are unknown, so we can't adjust for them. They are things that, even though we've adjusted for the age of dam and heterosis, age of the calf, contemporary group, we still have differences between animals that are non-genetic. They're environmental in nature. So what do we do? What do we do? Do we just throw our hands up? Do we just give up? No, we don't do that. We start out, we can think of it this way. We've got this big rock of unknown, and it is big. It, in fact, is quite big. And we start out by measuring this rock. We measure this rock. We have statistical tools that actually measure this rock of unknown. And it turns out that this rock can be measured. The size of this rock can be measured by 1 minus heritability. If you look up on the right-hand side, I just put up the gauge of how we measure the size of the unknown. It's 100% minus, and that 8 squared is a symbol for heritability. For those of you that don't know that, I'm sure many of you do, 8 squared is heritability. So 100% minus heritability is a measure of the unknown environmental effects. Okay? Well, what is heritability? Let's start out with the definition of heritability. And this is very important. I think it's critical that you zero in on this, and I think many of us have a very vague and if even maybe inaccurate view of heritability. My definition of heritability is this. It's a percent of the variation in adjusted records between animals in a contemporary group due to differences in breeding value. Remember breeding value, that's part of the genetic model. It's the part we're after. The value of an animal is apparent. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we've got a contemporary group here. We've got 4 bulls in this contemporary group. We've got a big one that's 800 pounds. We've got a little one that's 600, and the other 2 are in the middle. Okay? So we've already adjusted them for age, age of dam, heterosis level, and they're in the same contemporary group. So we need a gauge of the differences between these animals. What proportion, what percent of the differences between these animals is due to breeding value, and what percent is due to the unknown rock that we deal with in animal breeding? Well, we know that in our population, heritability of weaning weight is about 30%, right? The heritability of weaning weight is 30%. Well, that also implies, remember, we've already made the adjustments for everything else. All we've got left is, in this record, all we've got left is breeding value and unknown environment. So that implies, we just simply take 100% minus our heritability. That implies that 70% of the differences that we see between those animals, 70% is due to unknown environment, non-genetic factors that we cannot explain. 30% of the differences are due to breeding value. Okay? And that is why, when you look at that situation, that is why an animal's own phenotype, an animal's own weaning weight, birth weight, most any trait we're going to look at is not a very good gauge of that animal's genetic value, of that animal's breeding value. Because, look, in the case of weaning weight, even after we've made the adjustment for the age of dam, heterosis, we've made all these adjustments, and we're looking at cattle within the same contemporary group. Even then, 70% of the differences we're seeing on the average are due to the unknown environmental effect. So we can take that further, and we know that the heritability of most traits is about 10 to 50%. On the low end, we tend to see traits like reproduction and calving ease, might be 10 plus or minus 5% typically. And on the high end, at 50%, we're looking at structural traits, height, things like carcass traits. We tend to see up in that 50% range, give or take some percentile. So when you know that, you can make this conclusion, that even after making adjustments for age and heterosis, even after we've made these adjustments for age and heterosis, the differences we see between animals, adjusted records, within a contemporary group, remember this is within a contemporary group, cattle that were in the same pasture, on the same feed, for all intents and purposes, identical environment as far as we can tell, we still see anywhere from 50 to 90% of the differences between those animals due to something that's non-genetic. 50 to 90%. And that's simply, if you go from 10 to 50% and you do the subtraction, like I said, 100% minus heritability tells us the proportion of those records, the differences in the records that are due to unknown environment. So what can we do about that? What can we do about it? And again, I'll speak to that conclusion. That is also why trying to evaluate differences between animals in the show ring, no matter what trait you're looking at, whether it's growth, whether it's structure, whether it's any trait you can conceive of in the show ring, is difficult, if not impossible. And that's because, first of all, we're really not making any adjustments. We're grouping animals into a group by an age, and they have a month to a month and a half between them. And they're coming from all different parts of the country under different management regimes, under different nutritional regimes. So that means, or that makes the evaluation of animals in the show ring almost new. We're really not sorting between any genetic differences in the show ring. And I know that's hard to hear. That's really hard to hear, but it's fact. It's a fact. So what do? Do we throw up our hands and give up? No, we persevere. What we do is we submit more data. And we submit data, and as we submit data, we chip away at that rock. We're chipping away at that rock with each phenotype that comes in. So the rock size, you know, we've measured the rock and we know the size is dependent on the heritability of the trait. So with highly heritable traits, the rock isn't nearly as big as with lowly heritable traits. So if we're talking about carcass traits, we're dealing with a smaller rock. If we're talking about calving ease or reproductive traits, we're dealing with a bigger rock. Okay? And each phenotype that comes in chips away at the rock. Each phenotype, as we send more and more data in on a sire, we get a better and better picture of that sire because we're chipping away at that rock. We're getting rid of more and more of the unknown environmental effect. Of course, the more heritable the trait, the more the rock that each phenotype removes. So basically, I'm saying that we get more bang for our buck out of getting a marbling score, and I didn't say IMF, I'm saying a marbling score. We get more bang for our buck out of that than we would a calving ease score if we're looking at comparing individual pieces of information. Now that said, no matter what the level of heritability, if we send in enough data, we eventually reduce the rock to nothing. The unknown rock goes to nothing. Okay, and that is if we get enough data, and of course that's only on highly evaluated AI sires that have an accuracy of 1. The reason they have an accuracy of 1 is the unknown has gone down to 0, and we can see the animal's breeding value as clear as day. Okay, and that is regardless of a highly heritable trait or a lowly heritable trait. It just means with a lowly heritable trait, it takes more data. And also, another caveat is it needs to be data on the trait we're collecting. We can never remove the entire rock by using ultrasound. If we're trying to predict marbling or ribeye area, we're not going to remove the entire rock with ultrasound. We need carcass data. Okay, so let's go back to the original equation. We've got the genetic model, and by now I'm sure I've beaten you over the head to death enough that hopefully it's imprinted on your mind. We've got the phenotype that equals some average plus a breeding value plus an environmental effect. And as you've seen, we can expand the environmental effect. It's just the same equation. I've only shown you one equation throughout this whole presentation. We've just expanded it. In this case, we've got the phenotype, average, breeding value, and the rest of it, the age, heterosis, contemporary group, and unknown, simply an expansion of the environmental effect. Now, if we go back again to math class, remember, we're interested in breeding value. So back in math class, what did we do if we wanted to solve for something? If we wanted to get at breeding value, we know we have to move it over to one side of the equation and move everything else over to the other side of the equation. So we simply do that. We've got breeding value now over on the left-hand side and everything else over on the right-hand side. Okay? We're solving for breeding value, and this in essence is what we're doing when we calculate an EPD. Now we've got millions of equations that we're solving simultaneously, and it's very computationally intense, but this is really at the root of what we're doing. We're solving for breeding value, and remember all we have to do is cut it in half and we've got an EPD. Okay, so let's take a look at the equation. Well, now we're after breeding value. We know phenotype. You guys send phenotypes to us. We've got the phenotypes. We can certainly calculate the average. We can adjust for age and the age of dam. We can adjust for heterosis levels, remove that effect. And now, through Dr. Henderson's methodology, his equations, which, by the way, are called best linear unbiased prediction, or BLUF, which you've probably heard of if you paid any attention to genetic evaluation, we can actually adjust for the level of contemporary group. But we've still got this fly in the ointment. But now what we can do is we can continue to submit data. And as we submit data, this unknown factor shrinks. And as the unknown factor shrinks, we get a better and better picture of our breeding value. We get a more accurate picture of our breeding value to the point where we send in enough data, no matter what the trait, we have a perfect picture of breeding value. We know it with virtual certainty because we've accounted for everything else in the equation. So that in a nutshell is how we calculate EPDs. I've glossed over some things and probably oversimplified some things, but this really is at the core of the calculation of EPDs, and if this made sense to you, you shouldn't think of the calculation of EPDs as a black box anymore. And I'll close with this slide. I like to use this slide several times, and many of you have probably seen it. I like to think of cattle breeding as playing poker, and any of you that have played poker know that the house has a big stack of cards that they have and they hand out, and that stack of cards would be analogous to all of the genes floating around in a population, and then the dealer will hand out or pass out hands to the different players, and that's like the genes that are being passed out to the different animals, or the animals, the genes that they carry. Those are analogous to the hands. And we know that some of the cards are laying down and some of them are face up. And it sure would be good if we could see them all. That's our goal. If we could see all of the hands, if we could see all of the cards and they were all face up, that would be wonderful. And there are two ways to play poker. You can play poker like the Rain Man. If you're playing poker like the Rain Man, you're leveraging every bit of information you can. You're counting all the cards. You probably have a very good handle of what is in the cards that are held in each hand, and you've got a huge advantage in playing poker. Or you can play poker like the rest of us, like Elmer Fudd. Just kind of shoot by the seat of your pants. And the difference in those two types of poker playing would be equivalent to the use of EPDs versus the use of anything else. If you use EPDs, you are breeding cattle like the Rain Man. You're leveraging all 9 million animals, all the phenotypes, all the genetic relationships between all the 9 million animals, the heritabilities, the genetic correlations. All of the information is being leveraged to give you the best prediction of what the hand that animal carries, or whatever animal you're interested in, the best prediction possible. If you're using anything else, ratios, adjusted weights, actual weights, anything else, you're breeding cattle like Elmer Fudd. So with that, I'll close and open up the phone lines to anybody that has questions. Yep. I see Keith Price. To Keith Price that has a question. Hello.
Keith, are you on the phone line? Or are you on the computer mic?
Yeah. Well, that depends on several factors. One of the first factors, and one that I touched on is the heritability of the trait. With highly heritable traits, it doesn't take as much data, it doesn't take as many phenotypes as it does with lowly heritable traits to hit the higher levels of accuracy. It's also a factor of how well connected the sire is. In other words, if you're trying to test a sire and you've got a lot of highly used, very highly evaluated sires that are being compared against them in the contemporary groups, that'll certainly hasten the rise in accuracy. And there are some other factors, correlated traits, if you have traits that are correlated. But generally, correlated traits, when you start to get up to high accuracies like that, the information is coming from the phenotypes on the trait itself. In other words, if we're to talk about marbling, if all we were to do was collect ultrasound, IMF from ultrasound, we would hit a ceiling of accuracy somewhere around 30%. We would not get above that accuracy if all we had was ultrasound measurements. In order to get any higher than that, it's going to require actual marbling scores. And when it comes to a trait like marbling, which is pretty highly heritable, having probably 500 or so 500 or so marbling scores would probably get us in that category, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it also depends, you know, as a bull gets older, we have sires in our database that have never had a marbling score collected on them, but they can have extremely high accuracy for marbling because many of their sons and grandsons and great-grandsons have had data collected on them. So there are a lot of ways to get high accuracy, and there isn't any set number. It's difficult to get a set number, give a set number to hit an accuracy threshold.
Here on this seminar. So one of the themes of what Wade has just gone through here, and it always is, I've said through enough of his seminars, is that we don't perhaps respect and cherish enough of the high accuracy sires in our database. So I'm not sure this is a fair example, but let's just say we're looking to improve a trait, and perhaps we're looking at yearling weight. And if there were two sires, one was a yearling bull, and his yearling weight EPD was 70, and there was an old bull. Oh, incidentally, the yearling bull's accuracy would be about 0.3. And if there was an old bull, out of a semen company, and he was up to 0.95, and he was only a few pounds less in terms of yearling weight, we ought to be pretty darn careful grabbing onto that young bull when you know you got a bull behind him, just a couple of pounds, that's got accuracy 0.9 something. The risk is huge in these young sires with low accuracy. Right? True, Ray?
Yeah, that's right. But for one thing, of course, one thing we're all faced with is, yes, you can. When it comes to AI, we have some latitude in the accuracy level we're choosing. But typically, when we're using a walking bull, at least if you're a commercial cattleman, you're generally going to be using an animal that has, like Jerry said, fairly low accuracy, 0.3 typically at best. Well, the thing about that is that, first of all, even though we consider that low, that's much more accurate than using any other assessment of that bull. If we're using a ratio, if we're using an adjusted weight, actual weight, anything like that, it's going to be nowhere near that level of accuracy. So we've got more accuracy, even in a low accuracy EPD, much more accuracy than we would using anything else. The other thing is, with low accuracy EPDs, or animals that have low accuracy predictions, if we sample a group of them, when you go out, if you're going to buy if you're a commercial producer and you buy 5, 10 bulls, you're going to get the average of what those bulls' EPDs are. That's going to, now some of them are going to go maybe way up, some of them are going to go way down, but you will get the average. Because there is strength in numbers, that average of a large group is going to be pretty much the average that you will end up achieving. It's just that the bulls, the individual bulls, will move around a fair bit when they are low accuracy predictions.
I come back to you is that you're right about the commercial farms and ranches in this nation that primarily buy virgin yearling bulls. They're pretty well stuck with using low accuracy bulls. The yearling bull is about 0.3 accuracy for yearling weight EPD, as an example. However, interestingly enough, the farms and ranches across this nation, the commercial farms and ranches across this nation, that AI, let's just say they synchronize an AI their yearling heifers, they will typically AI to high accuracy proven calving these bulls.
Yeah. It's probably a wise decision, especially on heifers, because you certainly don't want any surprises on heifers when it comes to cavities.
Any more comments out there? Comments and questions? Greg Bailey, can you get off mute and talk to us? Try maybe. Anybody else? Okay, well, wait. Carrie, can you, if you've got a question, can you take your computer or phone off mute? Okay, sounds like maybe we're close to wrapping up. Wade Shafer, final comments before we sign off?
Well, I guess just thank everybody for logging on and try to stay warm tonight. I know a lot of the Midwest is pretty chilly. And I guess I forgot to, well, I missed one slide, but basically it was, as you would expect, to use EPDs is what the slide says.
Making genetic progress and moving our cattle in the direction that the beef industry expects us to deliver. And so, Wade, thanks tonight for talking to us about how you make EPDs. If everybody would watch the website, we'll have another seminar in another month or so. Everybody, as Wade said, stay warm. We'll talk with you in about a month. Thanks, everybody.